Hello, welcome back to my channel and part one of my Val Lewton retrospective. Now, Val Lewton was a Russian emigre to America, and he made a series of really interesting horror films in the 1940s for RKO. Cheap films, but really intelligent horror films that sort of modernised the horror film, really. You know, up until this point, the American horror film had used old Gothic texts like Dracula and Frankenstein. It had gone back to sort of European models of horror. Lewton modernised the horror film. He brought it into modern America, mixing those old folk tales and that world of old horror with the modern, everyday world. It's a very unusual series of films, these films. There are nine of them. And they're unusual because you don't often get the producer regarded as the auteur. I mean, Lewton also actually wrote most of the screenplays. He sort of did the final draft of each of the screenplays, so he was very heavily involved in each film. But it's quite unusual to have a series of films related to the producer. Three of the first films that they made was made with the director Jacques Tourneur, who went on to become a major figure, and he's certainly responsible for the beauty of some of those original films. But in fact, all of the films are suffused with the same kind of eerie feel, and all of them are extraordinarily strong. I'm looking at them in a random order, just how I felt like watching them. And I'm starting in the middle, really, with The Ghost Ship, which was made in 1943. Now, The Ghost Ship is not one of the most popular or known of the RKO films. Because of a lawsuit against the film, it was accused of plagiarism in the script. It was actually unavailable for about 50 years. It only became re-available in the 1990s. So it's not very well known. And for a lot of horror fans, it's a bit of a disappointment when they first discover it, because it's called The Ghost Ship, so you think it's going to be this ghost story. In fact, it's not really a horror film at all. It's a psychological thriller. It's a story of men at sea, and I like stories of men at sea. And it stars Richard Dix, who was a regular leading man for RKO, and he plays this quite stern disciplinarian captain on board this trade vessel. And a new, young, bright third officer joins the crew. And he comes to believe that the captain is mad and homicidal and is getting rid of any of the sailors on board he doesn't like. So that's the kind of story. It's not really about ghosts at all. So often people find it a bit disappointing and one of the least interesting in the series because it doesn't really have a horror element and it doesn't have Boris Karloff, who appears in the later movies. But I really, really like this film. First of all, I like stories, tales of the sea, and I think this is a very subtle and intelligent one. The script is very straightforward, with a very straightforward idea. Val Lewton originally made the film just to make use of a standing set. I mean, these were very cheap films. There was a ship set available, so he just wrote a story about a ship. But it's a very intelligent movie, and it shows how Lewton's films are, how unusual they are for their time. So the film starts, the young officer is walking along a street at night, and there's a blind man, selling things for charity. And he immediately seems to know this young man. He knows that he's a sailor, he knows that he's an officer, and he tells him that you're going to have bad luck on this ship. What always happens in Lewton films is that an ordinary person in the ordinary everyday world, they're in a regular situation, but the planes of the supernatural, of a sort of mystical sense of the world, make themselves evident right at the start of the film. So that we have these kind of choral figures who come in who seem to know more than they should know. They seem to understand things on another plane, So we also have the mute sailor on board, played by Skelton Knaggs. And he has this sort of interior monologue that we hear, and he sees the things that the other men don't see. There's also a wonderful character played by a man called Sir Lancelot, this kind of West Indian sailor who sings a lot of songs, and he's a figure who appears in quite a few of the movies. He's also in I Walked with a Zombie, and his songs seem to comment on the action with greater knowledge of what's going on. And so these figures, you always find them in Val Lewton films. They put the film on a sort of mystical plane of understanding, which comments and interacts with the ordinary everyday plane of existence. It's these little details that make the Val Lewton film so special. For example, when the young man goes up the gangplank onto the ship and he asks where the captain is, Skelton Nags the mute signals with his knife. And it's a great shot, but also it's brilliant because it anticipates the fate of where the whole movie is going, because eventually it will be Skelton Nags' mute character who saves this young officer's life when the crazy captain comes into his bunk room and he and the mute have a knife fight. So it's just those little details that make these films so special, so poetic, so lyrical. I think we should speak up here for the director Mark Robson, who directed the vast majority of the Val Lewton films and doesn't get nearly enough credit. He has a really good feel for pacing, atmosphere, composition, the set piece sequence, which in this film is actually a boat hook coming unloose, and it's sort of swinging around the deck, and it's causing damage. And this is the moment where the young man starts to realise that the captain is dangerously unhinged, that he should have secured the boat hook, but he lets it go so that the men are in danger. And actually, this set piece sequence, Robson, through his direction and with Nicholas Musaraka's brilliant cinematography, it becomes something as horrible and as frightening as any bogeyman or monster. The film has recently been released on Blu-ray for the first time, I believe. And there's been a bit of a hoo-ha in the US because right at the beginning of the film, there's a very important moment of symbolism. The young man meets the captain and they're talking about authority, and authority is the theme of the film. What does authority do to a man? Does it make him into a monster? And the young lad, the young officer, sees a moth hovering around this light, and he goes to kill it. And the captain says, "Don't kill it. Its safety does not depend on you. Whereas the safety of my men depends on me, therefore I can do what I want with them." And in this new Blu-ray version in the US, they've cleaned up the image so much that you can't see the moth. And this has caused a bit of a palaver on Blu-ray forums. Apparently in the UK Blu-ray, you can still see the moth. The moth is still there. It's very important, that moth. So watch out for that if you're in the US. Joking apart, these little details of what's in the camera are so important because this is a beautifully shot film. It was shot on a cheap standing set, but the use of shadow and light is incredible, so that when the first death happens, it's revealed by the young officer throwing a light onto it, symbolically throwing a light onto what's really happening on the ship. They gather round the body, and Skelton Nags the mute. You cut to a shot of him when he's delivering his monologue. He's in light, and the two figures in profile next to him are in complete shadow. And this relationship of light and shadow goes through the entire movie, right through to the end, where what appears to be a happy ending, with the young officer meeting a potential love interest, is done off camera and only through their shadows thrown onto some crates. So again, Mark Robson's direction is brilliant. And again, a sign of Robson's direction and the intelligence of the Val Lewton films, look at the amount of effort that's gone into the realism of the Spanish port that they sail into. Look at how when the young officer brings the captain, he brings him to a trial. Look at the understatedness, the respect and intelligence of the way that is covered. There's no melodrama here. But when it does want to be horrific, this film can really deliver. There's a scene where a man gets killed. He's in a sort of chamber underneath the deck, and they're putting in the long metal chain, and the metal chain starts clanking faster and faster, and the guy realizes he can't get out, and he's killed. He's buried under this gigantic metal chain, and it's a genuinely effective and horrible sequence. Even now, it's brilliantly done. What I also like about this film is its psychological realism. The character that Dix plays, he's not just a mad guy. You actually feel sympathy for him, and there's this long sequence where he speaks to this woman who he's loved for a long time, and he realises he's going mad. He knows he's losing his mind. So this is a much more psychologically complex and subtle film than you get in most horror movies. It's also interesting that it was made in 1943 during the height of the war, and it's about the abuse of authority. It's about a man who's come to believe that he has ultimate authority over others. Because their safety is in his care, he can do what he wants with them. And of course, this is an oblique reflection on fascism, right? And what's interesting is that the young hero of the film, he's the only one who questions it. The others don't question it. They follow orders, right? They don't want to rock the boat, you know, no pun intended. They don't want to question it because they want to keep their jobs, they want to keep things smooth running. But of course, that allows madness to develop. So the whole film is a rather sweet, rather simple, but very intelligent, you know, précis of how fascism can come to blossom amongst a group of otherwise decent men. So, in fact, this film, which is barely 60, it's just over 60 minutes long, very simple, very cheap, is actually a beautiful little piece of work. And that's why I started this retrospective by looking at it, because instead of looking at the famous ones or the ones where you can unpack loads of stuff about it, I wanted to start with what seems to be on the surface the most simple of the films. But it's actually a really beautiful little piece of work, and I highly recommend it.